I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of the supply of the drug which alone makes my life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. Dagon is, if nothing else, the prototypical Lovecraft tale. Written in 1917, the story of a sailor who happens upon an underwater civilization is filled with themes and motifs that would later become the hallmarks of his work. Right from the off, we learn of the narrator's unstable mental condition, underpinned by the suicidal thoughts that plague his mind. Lovecraft was 26 when he wrote Dagon, and the overtly dark tones that permeate the opening paragraph are reflected in the events of his early life. 9 years before writing Dagon, Lovecraft suffered his own mental breakdown in high school, which led to a period of hermeticity where he spoke to almost no one save his mother over the next 5 years. Scholars argue over the cause, but whatever the reason for the illness, the experience stayed with him and bled into his writing. The narrator begins by recounting the tale of his capture by and escape from German forces during World War I. For several days, he drifts aimlessly on a small boat, until one morning he wakes to find himself marooned on a strange landmass covered in a murky black marsh. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. As in the case of the poem Night Gaunts, Lovecraft's dreams also influenced the writing of Dagon. Responding to criticism of the story, Lovecraft defended the actions of his protagonist in an essay titled In Defense of Dagon. The hero victim is sucked half into the mire, yet he does crawl. He pulls himself along in the detestable ooze, tenaciously though it cling to him. I know, for I dreamed that whole hideous crawl, and can yet feel the ooze sucking me down. Clearly the dream left a strong impression on the young writer, and the dark mood continues throughout the tale. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. The vivid image of a sky reflecting the bleakness of the dark earthen landscape suggests feelings of entrapment and even vertigo in the already confused and beleaguered narrator. The disorientation is caused by a feeling of having moved from the familiar norms and rules of our world to something quite alien. After recovering from the initial shock of his surroundings, the narrator proceeds to travel towards a vague mound in the distance. The journey takes several days, forcing him to rest and sleep in the drying swamp bed. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. A gibbous moon is essentially one that's over half visible, and Lovecraft had been fascinated with the Earth's major satellite from a young age, penning several articles commentating on various lunar mysteries, including the question of whether life existed on the moon, the constitution of its atmosphere, and the genesis of the various indentations that marked its surface. As a motif, the gibbous moon would become a staple of Lovecraft's writing. In The Doom That Came to Sarnath, a race of amphibious beings called the Ib was said to worship Bokrug, a giant water lizard, in nocturnal festivals under a gibbous moon. By the time the narrator finally summits the mound, he finds himself on the edge of a deep, dark chasm. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost, and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. Lovecraft wasn't a religious man by any means, but imagery from traditional and ancient myths often made its way into his stories. Here we have two distinct references. First, to Paradise Lost, John Milton's epic poem chronicling the temptation of Adam and Eve by Satan and their eventual expulsion from the Garden of Eden. The second refers to the mythical river Styx, running through Hades, the Greek underworld. In both cases the allusion is clear. The narrator felt as if he were staring into the pits of hell itself. The idea of hell, rising up from the deep, to spew forth into the domains of man, feeds into the wider apocalyptic themes in Lovecraft's work. Which should come to no surprise considering Dagon was written during World War I, when the greatest conflict in human history was wreaking untold devastation across Europe and resulted in the fall of no less than 4 great empires. To men of the time, it must have felt like the end of the world, if not the end of history itself. The narrator makes his way down the crater into the dark abyss, only to discover the remnants of an ancient civilization, filled with cyclopean monoliths and pictorial art created by a hitherto unknown race. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Ancient civilizations populated by eldritch beings would become another staple of Lovecraft's stories. In the case of Dagon, the race is never named, but rather described in detail as half-man, half-fish-like beings with webbed hands and feet, large lips, bulbous eyes, and as Lovecraft puts it, other features less pleasant to recall. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, and while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. Of all the creatures in Lovecraft's mythos, none is as widely recognized as the cosmic entity Cthulhu, but titular Dagon is clearly an early Cthulhu prototype. The inspiration for the monster is, at least in part, an ancient Semitic deity named Dagon. The actual myths, dogmas, and culture that surround Dagon are unclear and steeped in contradiction. But by around the 19th and 20th centuries, when Lovecraft was just beginning his career, many scholars had concluded that Dagon was a fish god, and so it became a popular motif in tales and art of the time, as either progenitor or deity to equally mythical amphibious races. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand, the window, the window. The tale ends with our narrator having somehow managed to escape the clutches of Dagon, returning to civilization alive but traumatized, clinging to sanity only with the aid of opiates. His tone is hysterical, his senses paranoid, and his prophecies apocalyptic. His final desperate sally speaks of an unnamed yet terrifying threat in the form of a slippery body lumbering against his door, an allusion to the beings that created the city of Dagon. Did Lovecraft really intend for his readers to believe that grotesque beings from the sea have chased this poor soul from the Pacific to San Francisco? Or are we merely reading the delusional ramblings of a madman that has long since taken leave of his senses? Much like our tragic narrator, we may never know for sure.